Some Sadducees, those who say that there is no resurrection, approached Jesus, and they put this question to him: Master, we have it from Moses in writing that if a man's married brother dies childless, the man must marry the widow to raise up children for his brother. Well, then, there were 7 brothers. The first, having married a wife, died childless. The second and then the third married the widow, and the same with all 7. They died, leaving no children. Finally, the woman herself died. Now, at the resurrection, to which of them will she be wife, since she had been married to all 7? Jesus replied, The children of this world take wives and husbands, but those who are to be judged worthy of a place in the other world and in the resurrection from the dead do not marry, because they can no longer die, for they are the same as the angels, and being children of the resurrection, they are sons of God. And Moses himself implies that the dead rise again, in the passage about the bush, where he calls the Lord the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now he is God not of the dead, but of the living, for to him all men are in fact alive. The Gospel of the Lord. In today's Gospel reading, Jesus finds himself in the middle of a theological controversy. And the controversy concerns the doctrine of the resurrection. Unlike our time, when there's almost unanimous support for the doctrine, especially among us Christians, in the time of Jesus, especially among the Jews, the doctrine of the resurrection was a very controversial affair. Rejecting this notion of the resurrection of the dead, rejecting also the existence of angels or angelic spirits, was this aristocratic, conservative group of Jews called the Sadducees. On the other side of the debate, and closer to Jesus in belief and outlook, were the Pharisees, who were simply laymen trying to help ordinary people live the Jewish law faithfully in their daily life. The Sadducees rejected the doctrine of the resurrection on account of the fact that the resurrection is nowhere mentioned in the 5 books of Moses, and it was these books alone which the Sadducees accepted as authoritative scripture. In fact, though the surrounding cultures had a clear notion of the afterlife, like the Egyptians, early Israel did not share this belief. In fact, belief in the resurrection blossomed relatively late in Jewish tradition, just a few centuries before the time of Jesus. The Sadducees, therefore, approach Jesus with a question that is based on the whole notion of levirate marriage, and the question is intended to ridicule the doctrine of the resurrection. Just by way of explanation, levirate marriage is an ancient institution in which the unmarried brother of a man who has died is obliged to marry his widow so that she may produce an heir, and this heir can inherit the man's property. It is the vestige of a society which is completely patriarchal and in which a woman's welfare depends on her attachment to her male offspring or her husband. And so they present before Jesus a situation in which 7 brothers successively married a widow, each dying childless. At the resurrection, how are we going to sort out this confusion? Jesus takes the opportunity then to do 2 things. One, he corrects the misunderstanding of resurrection in the minds of the Sadducees. Secondly, he explains the basis on which people can believe in the resurrection. He begins by pointing out the fact that the resurrected life is not simply a continuation of our current life. Resurrection is different from resuscitation. The resuscitated corpse will die again. Lazarus, for example, in the Gospels, experiences resuscitation and not true resurrection. The resurrected life is a qualitatively and vastly different life from earthly life. Lazarus died again because this was really a resuscitation. The resurrected life is completely different. And so Jesus could say that the children of the resurrection are like the angels. They do not marry, they cannot die anymore. The second thing that Jesus does is that he explains the basis on which people can believe in the resurrection. And the basis is simply this: the resurrection rests on God's fidelity to the loving relationship that he establishes with every believer. God remembers us. As that beautiful song says, I have carved you on the palm of my hand. And because God remembers you and he remembers me, we are allowed to transcend every death in our lives, the death of failure, the death of drugs, the death of illness, even our physical death. That loving relationship leads us to transcend the gates of death. As I did my Bible reading this evening, however, my eyes were drawn to a few lines, and it reminded me of the story of a friend of mine whom I shall call Betty. Let's read the lines. It says, the children of this world take wives and husbands, but those who are judged worthy of a place in the other world and in the resurrection from the dead do not marry because they can no longer die, for they are the same as the angels, and being children of the resurrection, they are sons of God. They can no longer die. They do not marry because they can no longer die, for they are the same as the angels, and being children of the resurrection, they are sons and daughters of God. Betty, several years ago, lost the 3 men in her life, her husband and her 2 sons, in the space of 6 months. At the end of their deaths, the husband by cancer and her 2 sons by an accident almost 6 months exactly after their daddy died, Betty found herself alone and abandoned. Betty said to me at the time, I didn't even know how to pay my own bills. My husband and my children did everything for me. I wanted to die. Death for me meant being thrown out on the streets. Death for me meant going mad with grief. Death for me means losing everything that my husband and my sons had labored and slaved for. As divine providence would have it, Betty's life took another turn. And after several weeks of depression, Betty remembered the fact that she knew how to sew, and she knew how to ice cakes, and that she had a lot of friends. And so bit by bit, Betty began a small business, catering for people, icing their cakes at Christmas, baking cakes for them, and sewing clothes for friends whose children and loved ones were getting married. This became the seed of a small and increasingly profitable business. And bit by bit, Betty learned to handle her own affairs. And she was proud of the fact that she was even able to take out a bank loan to grow her business. Today, Betty finds herself a completely different woman. And she said to me quite recently, I look at people around me and I see them saying 100 psalms over some problem that worries them. And again, they're going back to the psalms, reminding God, which is okay. But why worry incessantly about a problem? She says, I look at people spending masses of money to keep away the very cancer that killed my husband. And she said, something? I am not going to spend that kind of money. Because if it's one thing that my problems taught me, it is that my life is completely in God's hands. There it is. Betty is a true child of the resurrection. Death for her meant abandonment. Death for her meant darkness and a life of fear. Betty had arrived at a point in her life when she could no longer die. She was no longer afraid of suffering, of losing it all. In the reading originally, taking wives and husbands symbolizes what people do to prolong their life. In the face of death, people live on in their children. That's why they take wives and husbands. The children of the resurrection, however, don't need to take wives and husbands. They no longer need to take the same measures that you and I do to preserve our life, to preserve our sense of security. They don't need to grow a bank account. They don't need to gather a mass of friends. They don't need to spend enormous sums of money on their health. All of it, all of our life, our fundamental security is in God and in God's memory of all of us. And because you and I are carved on the palm of God's hands, we don't need to worry. It makes no sense worrying, because ultimately, the security of our lives is not in our hands, but in the hands of God.